Bom dia, então bem-vindos a um ciclo de conferências da Osteoform Online. O ciclo de conferências tem o nome de Osteotalks. Vamos falar sobre osteopatia, temos vários convidados dentro das as mais diversas áreas, onde vamos discutir osteopatia e falar de temas relacionados com a prática osteopática. O nosso convidado não é mais do que Francesco Contiero, é mestre em osteopatia e fisioterapeuta, é docente na University College of Osteopathy, a antiga BSO, tem a especialidade em ciências fasciais e neurociência. Foi nosso convidado da Osteoform o ano passado com cursos biomecânica aplicada, onde inclui biomecânica, a fascia e as neurociências. E, portanto, este é o nosso convidado de hoje e vamos passar então à conversa com o Francesco. Francesco, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Hi. So very nice to see you. I hope you're well, your family as well, safe. And
I see you.
I just made a short introduction in Portuguese. Thank you very much for accepting this
Thank you for having
invitation. And so let's talk about fascia, neurosciences, and we're also gonna go into the very wonderful course you have. I just made a short introduction about your resume, your curriculum, but let's start how you got involved in the fascia and fascia sciences. How was your interest came about, and what's sort of your trajectory until now?
So I have perhaps a little bit of a strange background in the sense that I qualified. Well, first of all, I qualified in physiotherapy in Padova University in Italy, which is obviously the house of Stecco, and all the fascia research in fascial anatomy and myofascial manipulation according to Stecco method. And so even during my BSc, during my undergrad, even if it was the early stages of the fascial association, we were obviously exposed at the concept of fascial manipulation and fascial sciences. And I'm sure nowadays the students are a lot more exposed than what we were back then. But there was a sense that this was important, even if it wasn't integrated in the curriculum yet. And then my upbringing from a physiotherapy perspective was really related with neurorehabilitation, with post-stroke, multiple sclerosis, amputees, and so that was really my area of interest. And back then, I thought the last field I want to work in the future is sports sciences and sports medicine. And then fast forward 15 years, I'm working in sports medicine now. And obviously my practice has changed quite a lot. So after I finished my BSc with that neuro mind, I moved to the UK to do a master in osteopathy. I did a diploma first and then a master, so 4 years in total. And during those 4 years, I kept in touch with the Italian colleagues. I worked as a teacher assistant for a CPD company in Padova and around the north of Italy, and we were mainly teaching fascia. Well, obviously I was assisting, but we were mainly teaching fascial sciences, fascial research, fascial techniques to both physiotherapists and osteopaths, to manual therapists in general. I think those years were really quite a strong apprenticeship for me in terms of obviously following the teachers and doing the courses themselves like 8-9 times as assistant and then as a teacher myself. So that was really an important part of my journey. And as I said, that throughout those years, I qualified in osteopathy. So I developed an interest to classical osteopathy first and looking into the research behind it. And then I moved more towards the evidence-based, modern, let's say, if we can, concept of osteopathy, and which I married because I still practice now. And though that type of research, that type of journey brought me also to actually take a 1-year-long course in applied biomechanics, in applied functional science, it's called actually, in the States, in Michigan. And that was and that was really a very important part of my journey in terms of biomechanics, in terms of active assisted techniques and active techniques for my patients. Following all of that, after staying at the UCO, formerly, as you mentioned, I think BSO, as a neuroscience and clinical neurology lecturer and lead lecturer, which is the position I have at the moment, I ended up kind of a little bit summarizing, but also going a little bit freestyling in creating a series of courses that marry together the fascial sciences, the neurobiology of fascia, and the research that is behind it, what fascia means from both a mechanical and a neurophysiological perspective, with the applied biomechanics, so with the actual applied functional approach, with the functional mindset to our patients. And in these courses, really, there is a bit of everything. I throw in the salutogenic perspective, which I think in some areas of osteopathy has been a bit lost. The pain sciences and obviously the latest research in pain science, the latest research in fascial and fascial sciences, etc. So it's really a little bit my baby in terms of group of work for that week and week over. And it's a very fun course. I always get quite good feedback.
So hopefully you'll come to Portugal this year, or maybe the end of the year, or let's see how things evolved also with this pandemic state. But I'm pretty excited. I mean, it sounds fascinating. We both have common interests in neurosciences, neurology, and also biomechanics. I also teach a course in neural mobilization and stuff. So we have similar interests.
Absolutely.
So we came along it's a long road between the first descriptions of fascia, the first, I think in the early 19s, that when they start talking about fascia and fascia sensitivity, and then we came to a model of tensegrity that we applied into the human body, which explains fairly well the integration between muscles and joints and how the muscle chains and act accordingly to that tensegrity principles. But then we went into a biotensegrity where we wanted to include also cells and mechanotransduction and proteins and the forces, tension forces in the cellular extra matrix. And then we started to include fascia, because fascia we can include liquid form and solid forms, and we can include neuroreceptors and all of that into a model which tries to explain everything. And my question is fascia close to a theory of everything, which we can explain the interaction between organs, muscles, liquid, blood, and brain, let's say?
Yeah, I see where we're going. I think you're definitely right. There's been definitely a growing interest, an exponential, I would say, growing interest in fascial sciences. I think partially as well because there was a bit of a rush from a manual therapist and movement therapist perspective to try justifying a lot of approaches that weren't really well grounded in evidence-based medicine before. And so the community in that sense, in the early stages at least, when there were a lot of questions and not many answers, which, I mean, to be honest, we don't have a lot of answers now, but at least there is a lot more research on it. And at the early stages, there was definitely that justification desire from a movement and a manual therapy community, definitely. So there has been that growing interest. I think research has shown definitely that fascia, the different fascial models. So obviously we have. First of all, we need to be a little bit careful, and every single editorial you read in the last few years has pointed out into define what is fascia and define connective tissue not as a single tissue that is just surrounding the body, but actually a tissue that perhaps has actually for sure has functional and regional specializations, which needs to be taken into account. And so the anatomy of it is actually very relevant, and it can't really be, or it shouldn't really be generalized without a critical perspective behind it. But I do think, yes, that the different models, they do give quite a lot of support for some of the more, if you want, is using a bit of a buzzword, more holistic type of therapies and more holistic type of approaches. Now, I always say also to my students, it's always a bit, you always need to be very cautious, in particular in fascial sciences, where we don't have a huge amount of answers, but we have many, many questions. You need to be cautious on what you apply to clinical practice and the way you apply that. And it's always a matter of risk and benefit, right? So if you take some of the understandings from the fascial models and the current research into your clinical practice, as part of the integrated approach, then it is a good, probably good practice-based, it's a good practice. But then if you base your entire approach on evidence that is still perhaps looked at in laboratory, that is not as clear-cut, how does affect pain, for example, how does it affect clinical pictures, etc., then it changes a little bit the ethics of it and the risk and benefit. In some ways, for example, the model of biointegrity and the fascial integrity, I think, as well from a research perspective, and obviously you probably back me up on that, considering that is your area of interest as well. From a research perspective and looking at the new evidence, in particular laboratory evidence in terms of neurochemistry and neurotransmission, etc., is really, and protein synthesis, as you were saying, is really interesting. But then to correlate that with an actual clinical application, we are really, really far away from it. So when we talk about the clinical application of fascial sciences, I think we should perhaps ground ourselves on some of the research that has been done perhaps more than just a few years ago. So that has been done, that we've seen at the beginning of the 2000s and then around the 2010 time, where they were actually looking at the clinical relevance of it. But it is it is definitely an important structure. In particular, I mean, considering you teach also neuroscience as well, when I teach to the students in this new model of osteopathy, this concept of modern osteopathy, evidence-based osteopathy, we put a lot of emphasis on the sensorial world, and so this sensory motor integration, the sensory information coming from the periphery. And one thing that we did, we spent quite a lot of time looking at is the receptors that are in the peripheral system, that are in the peripheral tissues. And so we have a huge amount of information coming from the fascial system, the different receptors coming from the fascial system, the different the types of receptors and the type of information we get, exteroception and mechanoception within that exteroception are really, really important for that sensory information coming in. And then obviously we know, we have evidence that supports this idea that the fascial system is not only a sensory organ, like Schleip defined it in 2004, but is actually as well a very important part, a very important piece of the puzzle in motor control, right? Because the fascial and the connective tissue itself, and the relation between that connective tissue and the proprioception and the neuromuscular spindles and the motor neuronal excitability within that spinal segment really gives us a lot, at least to think about, when we are considering osteopathic models, when we are considering motor control, when we're considering let's say this spinal integration system in motor control, which were classically supposed to be, okay, it is the lowest part of the system, is the non-clever side of motor control, which actually now turns out to be very clever, very important in sport medicine, very important in coordination of different segments within movement, etc. So I think it has a huge potential in terms of clinical applications, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm rejoicing because I think it was last week I made a video about the input and output. They're interdependent and interrelated. The proprioception and the motor response. The motor response has to be adequate to the proprioception, and it's two sides of the same coin. So if one is
Absolutely.
dysfunctional, then yeah, it was funny because it just I made this a video last week. Um,
And it blends quite well together into the concept as well of
yeah.
thinking clinically, avoiding thinking a bit black and white, avoiding the black and white type of paradigm and diagnosis, and seeing things a lot more complex. There are a lot more factors in, even thinking about proprioception, motor neuronal thresholds, and all the other sensory information coming in as a dynamic thresholds of inputs. So something that we can obviously modulate, that we can interact with our clinical practice, both from a manual therapy and from an active therapy perspective, definitely.
Yeah. What do you think? Because as you said in the beginning, there's also the pain sciences and the developments in neurosciences, and how do we apply that to the clinical practice? But there are some authors who aiming to include also fascia in relation to emotions. Of course, we can include pain into emotional and motor components. But do you think we're gonna go to a point where we can actually make a direct link between fascia and emotions, or it's too far off?
I mean, it depends what you mean with direct. From a clinical perspective, I do think, obviously, because the fascial system and the connective tissue sensory system itself is obviously able to feedback so strongly to the central nervous system in terms of afferent information, mechanosception, etc. And perhaps also because there is, this is just a speculative model, but there might be some functional adaptation, a functional adaptation of the fascial system to continuous action. This is actually what in the future, what I would like my PhD to focus on. And if we were able to actually point the finger to fascial adaptation over time of overload, then we could think that also the sensory system is going to adapt to that particular repetitive load, the repetitive strain to the connective tissue. And so in some ways, these can definitely feed the pain memory system and the neurotagging system, at least at the cortical level, at the cortical limbic level, definitely. And obviously, it is something we will need to take into consideration. But I think to be honest with you, we probably are going to be exploring further and further the evidence-based background of that, and where we really need to look at from a physiological standpoint in terms of what are we working on. But to be honest, we're probably doing quite a lot of it already in clinical practice, even without completely knowing. Because yesterday I had a lecture on pain sciences and the manual therapy with my students at UCO, and we were actually talking. There is not a huge amount of sectoral evidence, so there is not a huge amount of solid defined evidence around painful memories and the use of that or the interaction of painful memories in physiotherapy and osteopathy practice. So we don't really know why we do some of the stuff we do, but we do know that they are important, that they do work. And so yes, I do think perhaps fascia is one of the areas of research we are going to look at more and more, and also in terms of pain sciences and painful memories and emotion, etc. I also think, still on pain sciences, if you allow me, I think there is the fascial system and what we know now of the specialization of the fascial system in terms of, as we said before, proprioception, in terms of motor control, etc., does as well allow or does justify and I'm obviously biased on this, but does justify a little bit more of a functional type of approach, because we do know that obviously we want the further we go into the research into the fascial system, but also the research into pain and pain sizes, etc., we do see that, yes, it is true there are some changes which are surrounding the neuroaxis, so they are general and they need a general approach there. But there are also a lot of components of that central sensitization pattern, for example, which are very specific to the tissues that have been that have undergone a threat at some point, right? And that have been correlated with that painful memory. And so because there is that particular specificity, I also think that the fascial model and the fascial research justifies the specificity to be also situational. So that is not only related with the knee and the tissues around the knee, but is also perhaps related with the tissue around the knee in a particular situation, in a particular proprioceptive environment or context, right? So when the patient is actually doing something with their knee. And I think the link there between what we do situationally for that patient and the pain size might actually be fascia, might actually be in the role of that connective tissue. Absolutely.
Fascinating. I mean, I don't know if the people who are watching have the notion that it's a connective tissue that is so rich in neuroreceptors, and from tactile receptors to vibrating receptors to nociceptors, and it's fascinating stuff.
And proprioceptors.
And I think maybe that's my perception as an osteopath in Portugal, but I think we still treat a lot of patients in a passive way. Lay down on your belly, on your back, and we mobilize tissues in a very passive way. I mean, mainly, and which buzzes me all the time, because we're movement.
Active beings, right?
Movement. Cells are moving all the time. They're connecting all the time, and they're moving all the time. So movement at the cellular level is extremely important, and so it is in a as a system, combination of systems. So including movement, active movement. It's very logical.
Yeah. I think I think there is, not only in Portugal, but there is definitely. Obviously, I worked in different places around the world, and there is definitely that type of. There is that history, right, from a professional background perspective. So, and in some ways, to be completely honest with you, I also think is a little bit more of a. And I don't want obviously to offend anybody, but it is a little bit more of a simplistic type of model, and which perhaps fits best with some type of practices, and perhaps even fits best with the patient perspective itself, right? Because we need to explain to the patient what we do, and some patients do prefer a simple explanation. And perhaps that also has quite a strong placebo correlation with what we do. And obviously, we don't want to take away the placebo effect. We want to enhance it in our clinical practice. But at the same time, we want to find the best possible way to practice, the best possible evidence-based model for our practice. And so I do agree that taking our practices from a plinth-based assessment and treatment to a more active assessment, definitely functional assessment, because we want to be proprioceptively authentic, fascial authentic, if we want, for our patient. And then also from a treatment perspective into that active treatment, not only as exercise prescription. That's something that I always struggle a little bit to get across as a message. So because I have both professional backgrounds, because I'm a physio and an osteopath, I do find myself being labeled as a physio a lot more than osteopath, because I do use an active approach. And I'm a firm believer that osteopathy shouldn't be identified with manual therapy, but should be identified with the principles of osteopathy and the background philosophy that we share. But nevertheless, there is a little bit of this correlation between active therapy, more physiotherapy style, while passive therapy, more osteopathy style. But I actually believe that that active treatment can be done in an active assisted way. So I do a lot of my manual therapy, a lot of my mobilization, a lot of my manipulations and soft tissue while the patient is actually moving through range, while the patient is performing a certain movement that is correlated with the function they can't do. So, the question is, what can't you do? Let's find a way for you to be able to do it, tweaking the biomechanics, and then let me help that particular process with my hands-on skills if that's needed.
And also the touch and the reassurance and the confidence.
100%.
It's very, very, very important. Okay, absolutely. So we're almost 35 or 40 minutes. Do you wanna give an input of your course, of your biomechanics course? Do you wanna talk about a little bit about that?
Definitely, yeah. So, this was a great introduction. Thank you again for having me. The course itself, I think we were planning for a 2-day course, and it's going to be focused on spinal biomechanics. And so, if you do come along, if you are interested, expect to look at the spine not from a postural perspective, but actually challenging what element of perhaps asymmetries or perhaps a functional limitation are actually clinically relevant to the patient, and how can we spot what is clinically relevant from what it might be just a difference or something that is still normal for your patient, but that might be outside what you expected as being a blueprint. And then looking at techniques, both in terms of assessment and treatment, on how to, we say, tweak the particular functional movement of the patient, so to challenge the particular function of the patient in order to help them achieve something, or in order to make them more resilient for a particular function.
Yeah. I mean, very excited. Is there anything else you wanna say? Because this, I mean, we could go on for days and weeks talking about this stuff. I mean, it's fascinating stuff, and we could go on. But is there anything else you would like to add, or
no, unless you want to add anything. Otherwise, that's it.
Okay. So thank you very much. I mean, I hope you stay safe. Also, your family. Thank you very much for joining, and hopefully we'll see you soon for this very interesting course in Portugal. Hopefully, so see you soon. Hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you.
E pronto, foi esta a nossa conversa com o Francesco Contiero. Espero que tenham gostado. Ficávamos aqui o resto do dia. Este dá pano para mangas. Este mundo da fascia e das ciências faciais é fascinante. A vermos também a evolução dos modelos da tensegridade, da biotensegridade e da fascia-tensegridade, lado a lado com aquilo que tem sido feito na área de investigação, na fascia, nos últimos anos. E, portanto, esperemos ver o Francesco Contiero este ano ainda. Não sabemos bem quais são as medidas que vão ser adotadas e que impacto é que esta pandemia vai ter na nossa vida. Mas, portanto, esperemos vê-lo o mais breve possível com a sua formação, que se chama Biomecânica Aplicada à Coluna Vertebral, mas é muito mais do que isso, como vocês ouviram. É a integração da biomecânica, da anatomia funcional, da neuromecânica e da fascia na prática clínica osteopática. O próximo convidado vai ser um osteopata, é autor de artigos científicos e autor de um livro que se chama 5 modelos osteopáticos. É ele, o Christian Lungi, que aceitou o nosso convite e, portanto, também estou muito feliz por isso. É um osteopata, um pensador muito interessante e, portanto, com algo a dizer sobre o estado de arte da osteopatia. É membro do COM, do Center for Osteopathic Medicine Collaboration, é membro do ROI da AISO, portanto está ativamente envolvido na regulação da osteopatia em Itália e, portanto, vai ser o nosso convidado. Vamos estar à conversa com ele na segunda-feira e pronto, esperamos que assistam a estas nossas ciclo de conferências chamado Osteotalks, e que possam seguir também através do site, através do Instagram ou através do Facebook, e esperamos vê-los em breve. Adeus!